Today I am going to be sharing a quick layer cake quilt pattern with you. You will love how quickly this quilt comes together and how it looks very complex, but is actually very easy to put together. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know I love those type of quilt patterns that are very easy and beginner friendly, but look a little complicated. All right, so for this layer cake quilt, you're going to need one layer cake, and you'll also need 2 yards of background fabric. So let me show you what I'm using for this quilt. All right, so I have this gorgeous layer cake of Moda Red and White Gatherings by Primitive Gatherings. And then I have this gorgeous background fabric. It is from the Sanctuary line of fabric, and it is available in my shop. So let's get started on this quilt. So this quilt is based around one quilt block. So once you figure out how to sew this one quilt block together, the quilt comes together very quickly. Here is the quilt block. It looks a little complicated with the little pieces, but trust me, this is a very easy quilt block to sew. So let's take a closer look at it. Okay, so here is the quilt block, but what you really need for this quilt block is just one layer cake square. So one 10 by 10 inch cut of fabric. And then you just need 2 strips of your background fabric that are 10 inches. And then 2 strips of the background fabric that is 11 inches. So from that 2 yards of background fabric, you're going to need to cut 84 1.5 inch by 10 inch strips and 84 1.5 inch by 11 inch strips. Now I am going to share with you some diagrams that will make this cutting a lot easier for you. I know that sounds like a lot of fabric and a lot of strips, but with these little tricks that I'm going to give you, it's going to make cutting those strips a lot easier, and you're going to get a lot of use out of your fabric. So here it goes. You're going to want to fold the yardage in half with your selvages together. So you're going to have a fold at the top of your fabric and then your selvages together down near you. Once your fabric is folded and lined up very even across your cutting mat, you're going to square up one side of your fabric, so trim it nice and straight, and then go ahead and trim off your selvage end. You'll want to make sure you still have 21 inches of fabric from that cleaned off selvage edge up to the fold. Then you're going to cut your 42 1.5 inch strips. Now, I know you're asking, I thought you said that you're going to cut 84 strips, but remember we have this folded in half, so each time that you cut, you'll be cutting 2 strips. So cut those 42 1.5 inch strips, and then after you get those cut, you can subcut it into the sizes that you need. So I like to cut the 10 inch strips first, and then I'll cut the 11 inch strips from the top. Now, if you don't want to cut all 42 of those strips at one time, that is fine. I left you a little bit of wiggle room on the fabric if you need to cut maybe 10 of the 1.5 inch strips and move the fabric that you haven't cut yet a little bit to the side, then subcut your 10 inch strips and then subcut 11 inch strips. You can definitely do that. Then when you move your fabric back over to cut some more of the 1.5 inch strips, you may want to square up that edge again just to make sure it stays nice and even as you cut. So I did give you a little bit of extra fabric. You won't need the whole 2 yards, but make sure you keep squaring up if you don't cut all 42 strips at one time. All right, so after getting all of that background fabric cut, it's time to start putting together the blocks, and everything will go so quickly here. So let's take a look at how we're going to set up these blocks. All right, so on step 1, you're going to be using those 10 inch strips. So I'm going to set the 11 inch strips to the side. All right, so the first cuts that we're going to make are along one side of the 10 inch square. So I'm going to line up my 2-inch line with the edge of my layer cake. So once I feel like it's nice and straight, I'm going to make my first cut. Now I'm not going to move the ruler or anything after I make this first cut because I want to go ahead and do my second cut, which is 4 inches. And I like to line up the 4-inch here. So if you don't feel comfortable doing it that way, you can always move your layer cake to the side and do a second 2-inch cut. So let me show you this cut first. So there's my 4-inch cut. So I have now segmented. Oh, my rotary blade must be getting tired. I need to replace it. That's okay. I'm going to still cut those. Okay, so now I have 3 segments here. I'm going to grab one of my design boards. This helps me keep everything nice and organized. And I'm going to lay them on it just in the order that they were. Now, it's not that big of a deal if you get like one turned or anything like that. It'll all still look the same as long as your fabric isn't directional. I just like to keep everything lined up if I can. Then I'm going to put those 10-inch strips in between there because that's where we're going to be sewing them in a minute. But let me show you cutting that one more time just in case you're not comfortable doing a 2-inch cut and then a 4-inch cut. So you can line up your ruler with the edge of one side of your 10-inch strip and cut that 2-inch cut. And then if you don't want to leave it in place and move over and cut the 4-inch, just slide the layer cake to the side a bit and then do another 2-inch cut. It'll essentially be the same cuts, just you don't have to worry about accidentally shifting something and your cuts being a little off. All right, so there we go. So I'm going to keep these lined up because I'm just going to work on one block at a time. So we have our start of our block here. Now, we want to make sure these strips stay lined up nice and even, and we want to make sure our sewing is nice and even. That will really help bring this quilt together nicely. So you can put some pins in here to make sure everything stays nice and lined up. So I'm going to pin right sides together my first kind of sashing strip onto my first layer cake cut and put some pins in to make sure it stays nice and even when I sew a 1/4-inch seam. You see I have everything right sides together. It's hard for me to pin to the side like that. I don't know why. So I'm going to make sure it's all lined up and put some pins in. And then I'll do the same with the second. I'm going to fold that sashing strip over. Make sure everything is lined up and add some pins. And then here the sewing is really easy. You're just going to sew these together using a 1/4-inch seam. So I'm going to sew across here and across here, and then I will sew the rest of the pieces all together too in that order that I showed you. So you're going to have a 2-inch layer cake, a sashing background strip, then a 2-inch layer cake, a sashing background strip, and then our larger segment of the layer cake. So let's get to sewing this and take a look at it. All right, so after sewing, this is how your block will look. Now, what I would suggest doing is to press your seams open. If you would like to press them to one side or the other, you can, but you're going to have a lot of seams coming together when you put the quilt together. So I really think having them pressed open would be your best bet, but it's definitely a personal preference. So I'm going to get these pressed open and then I will show you the next step. All right, so now that my block is pressed with the seams open, it should now measure 10 inches by 11 inches because of those added sashing strips. So let's take a look at the next steps. All right, so here is my block and it now measures about 10 inches by 11 inches. And you can see just by looking at the lines here, because of how I sew or how I press, it's a little bit off. So because my sewing is a little bit off in some places, I am going to trim up my block after they're all finished just to make sure they are a consistent size. But let's take a look at the next steps here. So you can see that because of my pinning, I did get a pretty nice and even line across here. Now, if yours is a little bit off in some places, which has happened to me sometimes, you could try and trim it up a little bit to get a consistent size. But here are the next steps. So what we're going to do is now cut in the opposite direction going through those sashing strips we just added. We're going to cut again a 2-inch strip and another 2-inch strip from that cut. I'm just going to move again to the 4-inch cut line. But if you would like, you could refer to how we did it before, where you move them apart and cut your 2-inch strip. And I have not, as you can see, changed my rotary blade yet. I still need to do that. Now, I'm going to put these pieces again on a design board just to keep them all straight again. And I'm sure you guessed what we are doing next. We are adding the 11-inch strips in. So there we go. You can already pretty much see that block design coming together. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm going to bring that kind of background sashing strip right sides together. Make sure it's nice and even. And I'm going to put some pins in. So you really want to make sure that everything is lined up straight. It will really help you get a nice block design in the end and make sure all your pieces when you put the quilt together line up nicely. Now, if you know me, you know that if it's not lining up, it's not the end of the world to me. Just kind of so be it. When you look at the design as a whole, it's going to look gorgeous, but I'm trying to give you some tips here along the way because I know everyone has different personalities and some of us need everything to line up perfect, and that's okay. So hopefully if you put a lot of pins in here and sew really slow 1/4-inch seams, if you need it to line up perfectly, these strips should line up nice and even for you. So I'm going to sew a 1/4-inch seam along here and a 1/4-inch seam along here, and then I'm going to bring the rest of these pieces together just as I did before. I am going to press these seams open as well, so I will show you that when it is all completed. All right, so here is my finished block all pressed. So I have all the seams pressed open. So let's take a closer look at it. All right, so there is my finished block and the seams are all pressed open, and I really tried to press them nice and flat. I used a little bit of flatter spray to help those seams hold in place. Now, if you are very good at cutting accurate cuts and sewing accurate seams and pressing really, really well without stretching your fabric, you may be able to use the block as it is now. It'll probably measure about 11 inches by 11 inches. But I'm going to trim mine down to 10.5 inches because I am definitely not perfect at cutting accurate cuts or sewing accurate seams. And sometimes I do get a little heavy-handed with the iron and can press a little bit of my fabric out of whack. So to kind of compensate for that, I'm going to trim my block down. So I'll show you how I'm going to trim mine. All right, so how I like to trim my block down is I like to focus on this area here because I feel like that is where the eye is going to be drawn, because there's going to be a lot of seams coming together here and kind of a lot of activity in the design. So I want to make sure that this area lines up really well with the next block. And the rest of them, because of how I'm going to cut this, may not line up perfect, but they will end up close. And for me, it's kind of a so be it, you know, if it's not all going to be accurate, at least some of it will. So I am going to line up this corner that should measure about 1 3/4, a 1 3/4 square. So I'm going to get that lined up really well, and then I'll kind of check down here and see if that line, that 1 3/4 line, lines up with the seam of this straight sashing. It doesn't, because I know I do not sew perfect. And then I'm going to look up here and see if this one lines up at 1 3/4, and it doesn't. So I'm going to kind of push it down a little bit and see how everything lines up. Okay, well, it's pretty good there. And actually that line got a little bit closer. So I have come about 10.5, and it's 11 over here. So I know if I trim this down to 10.5, it should definitely work. This side, for some reason, got very out of whack. So this is why I'm definitely going to be trimming my blocks down, because something in my seams or my cutting was a little bit off. So I still have the 1 3/4 here and the 1 3/4 here, and it looks like I'll definitely have some room there. And this sashing line actually lines up pretty well. So I'm going to hold that in place, and it looks like I'll just have a little bit trimmed off over here, maybe a little bit off the top, but not too bad. So what I really focused on is having a 1 3/4 block here, and you'll see why when we bring everything together. So I'm going to hold this really well. I probably should have grabbed one of my weights because this ruler is one of my really slick ones, and trim that. So not really trimming too much off on that direction, but remember this side over here was really off. So I'm going to turn my rotating cutting mat, and now this time I'm going to be lining up my 10.5 line on that freshly trimmed side. So I have 10.5 and 10.5 lined up really well. And look how off this side is. That got super crazy. So this is why I like to trim mine up. Just going to trim this first side and trim that second side. And now my block will be a nice, perfect 10.5 by 10.5 inch square. Now, I didn't get that extra 1/2 inch that I probably should have because my sewing or whatever was a little bit off, but I'd rather it come together nicely in the end and lose that little bit of extra fabric. But maybe for you, maybe your sewing was a lot better than mine and you can get a bigger block, or maybe you need to trim it up a little bit more. what I like to do is get all of my blocks finished and then measure them and see what size cut I can get. Pretty consistently, the best cut for me was 10.5 inches. So just see what might work for you. All right, you might really be wondering how this quilt is going to look when it starts coming together. So let me show you a little bit of a sneak peek. All right, so how amazing is this quilt going to look? It's kind of going to have a little bit of a plaid feel going through it. I love the reds and black. It is going to look amazing. So this quilt is going to use up that entire layer cake. So what you're going to have is 6 blocks across the top and 7 blocks down. That will get you using up all 42 of your layer cake pieces. So once I get all of these blocks sewn together, I'm going to lay them out and get a layout that I love, and I'll let you see that, and then we'll take a look at it all sewn together. Now, if you look over here, you see where all these seams are going to be coming together. That's a lot of seams, and that's why I really made sure that I pressed these open, because that's a lot of bulk coming together. And that's also why I really focused on this first square measurement being very accurate so I could bring these seams together. Now, we're also going to have seams coming together over here as well, and hopefully they line up really well, but our blocks are all going to be 10.5 inches. So if it's off just a little bit, I don't think it will stand out as much over here. Just kind of get it close. Once you get all of the quilting done and get it in the wash and get it all nice and cozy and crinkly, I don't think it'll be a big noticeable thing. Just so be it. Let it go. Have fun sewing this quilt. If it does bother you and you need it to be very, very accurate, definitely spend a little bit more time pinning and making sure everything lines up really well. But for me, I really like the process and I don't want to stress over all those things, and I don't notice it once the quilt is together. I know we all feel differently, but just try to have fun with it. So I'm going to get all these blocks sewn up and I'll show you my layout, and then I'll show you the quilt all finished. Well, the top. I may not have it quilted yet. After laying out all of the blocks for this quilt, I sewed together the rows and then sewn all the rows together. This quilt turned out so amazing. I absolutely love how it turned out. So it is about 60 inches by 70 inches, but you could of course add some borders to make it as large as you need, or take some blocks off to make it a little bit smaller if you need. Let me know what you think in the comments and if you're going to make one of these quilts. Just so you know, I have some amazing layer cakes available in my shop. I will link it into the description of this video. And there are some nice pairings in the yardage categories on my shop as well to get those 2 yards you would need as well. All right, so there is my layer cake quilt pattern. This is a free pattern, and if you need any other tips, or if you want to take a closer look at some of the diagrams I put together for cutting the yardage down to strips, that is all available on my blog for free as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.